Good afternoon, everybody. This is Greg Core at the Office of Special Education Programs, and this is our March monthly TA call. So I'm glad that you could join us. I know we have a number of Part B and Part C staff on the line, but we've also asked that you extend the invitation to other state agency staff who may be working with English language learners with disabilities. So as I've already communicated to you, this call is about English language learners with disabilities, and we know that growing numbers of our overall student population is comprised of English language learners, and about 11% of the population of students with disabilities comes from this group. We know that students with disabilities who are ELLs present a unique set of challenges, and in our call today we hope that we're able to share some information with you about this group and laws and guidance that addresses it, some updates to the 2016 FAQs that the department put out. We'll talk a little bit about how our office collaborates with other offices in the U.S. Department of Education around this particular group, and then highlight available resources, and that'll be both resources from OSEP funded TA centers as well as other ed funded TA centers. Amy Bay, who's sitting here next to me, will be doing the presentation. Amy is our lead for English language learners with disabilities here in the office. She does a tremendous job of working on this issue, educating us in the office, but also collaborating a lot with other offices within ed. Amy's done a great job of pulling together information for today's presentation. I think you'll find it both helpful and informative. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Amy, and mute my laptop.
All right. Hi, good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Very great. As Greg mentioned, I'm Amy Bay, state lead at EMSIP, and I'm the contact for EMSIP's work around English learners with disabilities. We are really excited to present this month's presentation, how the U.S. Department of Education supports English learner students with disabilities. I think, and we think, this is a really important topic, and it's a timely topic. As Greg mentioned, the population of English learners continues to grow. So we wanted to take a second to make sure you were aware of the resources available and the work going on in this space. So this presentation is heavily focused on school-age children, but we were sure to incorporate some content for our Part C colleagues, so I don't want to lose you guys as we go through this information. I'm going to be presenting a lot of information and a lot of resources, and I just wanted you to know that the slides will be available for download, I think sometime later today or at latest tomorrow morning. So don't worry about furiously writing down all these IRLs that I'm going to give you. As we go through, we'd like to accept questions through the question box in the webinar box, and we're going to pause a few times to address the questions as they come in. We might not be able to get to all the questions, but we're going to do our best. If you have questions after this presentation or state-specific questions, we encourage you to reach out to me or your OSEP state lead or your OESC state contact. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to start by presenting some data about English learners with disabilities throughout the United States. I will then share a few Q&As from our new non-regulatory guidance document that specifically addresses English learners with disabilities. I will then talk about how the Office of Special Education, OSEP, collaborates across programs and how we support English learners with disabilities. And finally, I will share information about how other offices in the U.S. Department of Education support work in this area. So let's start by looking at some of the data. The national percentage of children aged 6 through 21 served under IDEA Part B is around 13%. And the national percentage of English learners in classrooms across the country who receive services through IDEA Part B is 11%. So approximately that comes out to about 1% of students enrolled in public elementary and secondary school are English learners with disabilities. This chart shows the percentage of English learners with disabilities and the percentage of non-English learners with disabilities by disability category. As you can see, English learners with disabilities are more likely to be classified as having a specific learning disability, other health impairment, or speech or language impairment than non-English learners. There are two major pieces of legislation that the U.S. Department of Education administers that contain specific provisions that apply to English learners with disabilities. We are going to talk through these pieces of legislation and then walk through a recently released Q&A document. I know the majority of the people on this call today know this information because we're all state directors, right? But for others who might not be familiar with these laws or invited guests or need a refresher, I'm going to just quickly talk us through them. I think it'll be good for framing this part of the conversation and the new guidance. So OSEP administers the IDEA. As you may know, the IDEA is a law that makes available free, appropriate public education to eligible children with disabilities through the nation and ensures special education and related services to those children. The Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, or OESE, administers Title I and Title III of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, reauthorized as the Every Student Succeeds Act, or the ESSA. For the purposes of this presentation, I will use the acronym ESEA. The purpose of Title I Part A is to provide financial assistance to local education agencies and schools with high numbers or high percentages of children from low-income families to help ensure that all children meet challenging state academic standards. Title III Part A is designed to improve the education of limited English proficient children and youth by helping them learn English and meet challenging state academic content and student academic achievement standards. Title III's objectives also include assistance to teachers in implementing effective language instructional education programs, as well as promoting family engagement. The 2016 Resource Guide on Accountability for English Learners under the ESEA describes the accountability provision for English learners. The Resource Guide supports states in setting long-term goals and measurements of interim progress for students' English language proficiency, developing a progress in achieving English language proficiency indicator, and including all English learners in their updated accountability system, particularly English learners with disabilities, former English learners, and recently arrived English learners. Over the past year, the department has received a number of questions from states regarding the provision to establish and implement standardized statewide procedures for English learners for entry and exit from the EL status and language instruction educational programs. So in January of this year, the department released a new resource as an addendum to the guidance on the previous slide. There are a number of places in this addendum that address questions the department has received about how to implement standardized statewide entrance and exit procedures for English learners with disabilities. This resource addresses erroneously identified students, exiting ELs with disabilities from the English learner subgroup, and assessing English learners with a disability whose disability precludes assessment in one or more domains. So we're going to discuss those questions in the next few slides. Each SEA receiving a Title III Part A state formula grant must establish and implement standardized statewide entrance and exit procedures for English learners. These procedures are applicable for all English learners, including English learners with or at risk of having a disability. So I'm going to stop and stress this, just a very important requirement. The requirement to implement standardized statewide entrance and exit procedures for English learners is applicable to all English learners, including English learners with or at risk of having a disability. Statewide procedures for entrance might include, for example, the process for identification of an English learner, the timeline for implementing that process, the home language survey the LEAs use, the specific English language proficiency screener the LEAs administer, and the scores on the screener that will result in the identification of a student as an English learner. For exit, the procedures might include, for example, the timeline for administering the assessment, the score on the ELP assessment that corresponds to proficiency, and how the 4 domains of language, speaking, listening, reading, and writing, are factored into that score. The exit procedures would also include other statewide measures, if any, used to reclassify an English learner and exit that student from language services. A student who may be an EL must be assessed for such status within 30 days of enrollment in a school in the state. The state should also have procedures in place to identify in a timely manner English learners who may not have been identified during that initial identification period. An ESEA should make every effort to identify students who are English learners as soon as possible in order to provide timely support for students who may be in need of language services. Each LEA that uses funds under either Title I or Title III to supplement its language instruction educational programs must provide a parent of an English learner with notification that outlines their child's identification as an English learner and placement in the language instruction educational program. In instances where a student is considered to be erroneously identified as an English learner, an LEA should determine how to proceed based on these individual circumstances. So for example, if an LEA discovers that appropriate accommodations on the EL screening assessment were not provided to a student with a disability, the logical step would be to retest the student with appropriate accommodations. If the student then achieves a score proficient on the assessment, the EL designation would be removed. Erroneous identification may also occur when a parent misunderstands the home language survey and indicates that languages other than English are spoken at home because there is an occasional use of a language other than English, even though English is the dominant language used at home and the student does not speak or understand any other language. An EL must be exited from EL status when the student satisfies the state's standardized statewide exit procedures. In order to be exited from EL status, a student must demonstrate proficiency on a valid and reliable English language proficiency assessment. In a state that has additional exit procedures, however, a state who scores proficient on the English language proficiency assessment is not exited until the state meets those additional objective procedures. A determination that a disability precludes assessment in one or more domains must be made on an individualized basis by the child's IEP team, the student's 504 team, or for students covered under Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, by the team or individual designated by the LEA to make those decisions. Under the very rare circumstances when a student's disability precludes assessment in one or more domains, the student may be exited under the state's exit procedures based on a valid and reliable score of proficient on the remaining domains in which the student is able to be appropriately assessed. The department expects that very few children will need to be assessed in fewer than 4 domains due to a disability that precludes assessment in a particular domain, and that the vast majority of English learners with disabilities will be able to be assessed in all 4 domains with appropriate accommodations as needed, or by taking an alternate English language proficiency assessment for English learners who are students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. The department's assessment peer review process will evaluate the technical quality of the English language proficiency assessment, including that it provides valid and reliable results. This would include the state's procedures for assessing English learners on less than 4 domains. So long as the exit procedures include a score of proficient on the state's assessment based on the 4 language domains, an ESEA may include additional measures in its standardized statewide exit procedures that are valid, reliable, objective, and applied and weighted the same across the state. For example, an ESEA may include local input, such as the use of a teacher rubric or objective portfolio, as part of its statewide exit procedures, as long as the local input is applied and weighted consistently across the state. Okay, that was a lot of information, so we're going to pause here and just see if we have any questions. And if you haven't had the opportunity to submit your questions, please do so now. There's like the question tab. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any questions, so I'm going to continue on, but feel free to keep submitting and we'll pause again to see if we got any other questions. All right. OSEP works across the department to collaborate with multiple partner offices that administer programs, provide technical assistance, and enforce education laws pertaining to English learners with disabilities. These offices, represented by the planet on this graphic, include, among others, the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, the Office of English Language Acquisition, the Office of Civil Rights, and the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development. The stars on this graphic represent the work going on with our external partners. These partners include you, the states, parent centers, national technical assistance centers, and national comprehensive centers. And additionally, we work with organizations, for example, the Council of Chief State School Officers, who are doing work to support the needs of the student population. And we know we aren't the only groups collaborating to meet the needs of our students. This slide addresses some of the ways we've heard from states about what they are doing through collaboration to serve English learners with disabilities. This includes coordinated monitoring and technical assistance efforts, alignment of reporting, needs assessment planning, and leveraging federal funds. I'm going to take a second here to put a plug in for our survey at the end of this presentation. One of the questions is asking, what are you doing within your state to collaborate to meet the needs of English learners with disabilities? So for the next part of the presentation, I'm going to walk us through the work going on throughout the U.S. Department of Education. But I wanted to take a minute and stop and talk about what OSEP is doing specifically to make sure we're thinking about English learners through all the strands of the work we're involved in. OSEP's Monitoring and State Improvement Planning Division, or MSIP, coordinates its support on the needs of English learners with disabilities through a designated lead area. All of MSIP's lead area work is closely aligned with OSEP's priorities to support states in building their capacity to improve results for infants and toddlers and their families, and children and youth with disabilities, and to protect the individual rights of children and their parents. The purpose of our work through this lead area is to build capacity, guide technical assistance, and organize the work of the division around topics that impact outcomes for English learners with disabilities and their families. One of my main responsibilities is to collaborate with relevant office partners and technical assistance providers to identify opportunities and resources, including knowledge of best practices that will enhance our staff's ability to support states in building local capacity. OSEP is involved in a number of cross-office and cross-agency work groups that support the needs of English learners. Okay, let's start by looking at OSEP supported resources. There are two places for stakeholders to get information about the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Special Education. The first is the U.S. Department of Education's ed.gov IDEA website, which brings together IDEA information and resources from the department and our grantees. On this site, you will find our 2014 and 2015 Q&As on the inclusion of English learners with disabilities in English language proficiency assessments and a Dear Colleague letter on IEP translation. The other site is OSEP's Ideas That Work website, which is designed to provide easy access to information from our Research to Practice, or RTP, initiatives funded by OSEP. This website includes resources, links, and other important information relevant to OSEP's Research to Practice efforts. And both of these websites have pages dedicated to English learners, which is what I linked to on this page. And I did want to take a minute to remind you that all of these links, because you're going to get real website heavy, will be available from the presentation download later today after the presentation. The OSER's blog is a venue to tell stories and elevate voices that often aren't represented in traditional media. The voices could be of individuals, family members, teachers, or others, and could describe a personal experience, share resources, or offer advice for our readers. A recent blog article we published featured a teacher who worked with English learners with disability, and her blog speaks to several strategies that work well in facing challenges in serving English learners with disabilities. OSEP funds discretionary projects under Part D of the IDEA, including state personnel development grants, personnel development, technical assistance and dissemination, technology, and parent training and information centers. Many of these investments are known as OSEP centers, and depending on which authority they were funded under, include a focus of working directly with states. It is the state's decision how and when to access the centers unless directed by OSEP. The center's project officers work primarily in the Research to Practice division of OSEP. I'm going to highlight some resources and work coming out of our centers. The Center for Parent Information and Resources, which is parentcenterhub.org, has a wealth of materials for parents of English learners in a variety of languages other than English. In addition, the Center for Parent Information and Resources has links to several resources meant for educators, such as IRIS's Center's STAR Legacy module on effective instructional practices for teaching English language learners. This screenshot shows a useful checklist developed as part of the Building the Legacy training curriculum on IDEA. The checklist is intended to help IEP teams consider the education and disability-related needs of students with limited English proficiency who also have disabilities. Also on the ParentCenterHub.org website, any parent can find the parent center that serves them. In 2011, OSEP funded 3 model demonstration projects for English learners with or at risk of having a disability. The projects were charged with adapting, refining, and evaluating multi-tiered instructional frameworks and their components: progress monitoring, culturally responsive principles, reading instruction, and reading interventions to help improve reading achievement and language development for English learners with or at risk of having a disability, and to assist educators to determine if English learners who are experiencing reading difficulties have a disability. Through the work of these models, educators learn to work with the language resources that English learners brought to the classroom, which then had an impact on referral rates. Cohort 1 developed a series of topical briefs for school leaders, educators, and policymakers charged with implementing or supporting multi-tiered instruction for English learners. In September of 2016, OSEP funded a second cohort of projects focusing on tiered approaches to improving reading and language outcomes for English learners. These projects were developing and implementing culturally and linguistically responsive models for multi-tiered systems of support for English learners with disabilities. The second cohort is in the process of developing a series of topical briefs that focus on Tier 3, or intensive intervention, in MTSS for English learners. In addition, this cohort is piloting a culturally responsive RTI fidelity of implementation rubric to assist schools in implementing culturally responsive MTSS frameworks. The National Center for Educational Outcomes offers assistance to state personnel, educators, parents, and others concerned with the assessments and educational outcomes of students with disabilities and English learners with disabilities. There are two resources on the NCEO's website that I'd like to point out, and the two screenshots represent the two resources. For more than 15 years, NCEO has documented the public reporting of participation and performance data for students with disabilities, including English learners with disabilities. The report, 2015-16 Publicly Reported Assessment Results for Students with Disabilities and English Learners with Disabilities, examines the extent to which states reported assessment data for students with disabilities, including English learners with disabilities. The other report on this slide, a review of the literature on measuring English language proficiency progress of English learners with disabilities and English learners, identifies evidence-based practices used to measure progress of English learners with disabilities on English language proficiency assessment. The report discusses how studies have defined English language proficiency progress and the extent to which studies have examined English language progress for English learners with disabilities. Okay, are my Part C colleagues still out there? I hope so, because this slide we incorporated specifically thinking of your work. The department's 2016 fact sheet supporting dual language learners and early learning settings states, data indicate that about 1 in 5 school-age children speak a language other than English at home, a figure that has more than doubled in the past few decades. Estimates suggest that this number may be even higher for learners under the age of 6. An example of that is nearly a third of children in Head Start programs are dual language learners. The first resource on the slide, Success in Early Learning Programs in Elementary School for Immigrant Families, is a resource guide that provides tips for educators in early learning programs in elementary school. The second half of the guide, entitled Handbook for Parents and Guardians and Families, Building a Bright Future for All, provides tips for parents and guardians on how to promote and facilitate children's education from birth and play an active role in helping ensure children's success in school. The Division for Early Childhood's DEC's recommended practices were developed to provide guidance to practitioners and families about the most effective ways to improve the learning outcomes and promote the development of young children birth through age 5 who have or are at risk for developmental delays or disabilities. The purpose is to help bridge the gap between research and practice by highlighting those practices that have been shown to result in better outcomes for young children with disabilities and their families and the personnel who serve them. All of the recommended practices are available in Spanish. The Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center is working on inclusion indicators at the state and local level. They have stakeholders involved from OSEP-funded TA centers, Center on Enhancing Early Learning Outcomes, and centers from Head Start and Child Care TA centers. The National Center for Systemic Improvement and the Parent Technical Assistance Center Network provide additional resources to build capacity in understanding and effectively serving children from birth to age 5 who are learning more than one language. The last resource on the slide, questions and answers from the NCSI webinar on dual language learners and family partnerships and early child intervention in special education, is a follow-up to a webinar, which is also available on their website, which they held in December of 2017. All right, now I'm going to shift and talk about other resources available from other offices across ed. So that was really a summary of OSEP kind of supported work. Now we're going to shift and talk about across ed Department of Education and resources available there. So the U.S. Department of Education launched an interactive web page dedicated to data on English learners. The site uses colorful maps, bar graphs, and charts to provide a clear understanding of America's diverse EL population in a data story format based on the data from the Common Core of Data. The particular data story on this page provides data on English learners with disabilities, specifically on disability type. This is an interactive data page, so it's really interesting to look at. The Office of English Language Acquisition has synthesized key data on English learners into two-page sheets on a variety of topics. OSEP collaborated with OELA to develop the Students with Disabilities Who Are English Learners Fast Facts document. OELA's EL Toolkit was published in 2015 as a companion to support the 2015 Dear Colleague letter produced by the Department of Education, Office for Civil Rights, and the Department of Justice, outlining legal obligations for English learners. The English Learner Toolkit helps states and LEAs help English learners by fulfilling these obligations. Chapter 6 of the toolkit particularly focuses on sample tools and resources for addressing ELs with disabilities. Using educational technology, 21st Century Supports for English Learners Educator Toolkit is for all educators who want to use technology to help their English learners gain proficiency in English and meet academic goals. The toolkit offers 5 guiding principles for educators to apply in exploring new ways of working with and supporting their English learners through technology, starting with recognizing their students' unique needs and thinking through the best technology to meet those needs. The screenshot and link on this page leads you to the EL Resource Page website. This web page contains information about requirements related to English learners in the ESEA and provides links to resources to support states in developing and implementing programs and services for English learners. On this site, you will find a list of OESE's partner offices and some of the relevant resources they provide on English learners generally. The State Support Network is a technical assistance initiative of the U.S. Department of Education designed to support states and district school improvement efforts. States use this site to find valuable resources, engage with peers and experts in communities of practice, and stay updated and informed with the latest news and content to assist states in supporting improvement efforts. OESE funds a number of comprehensive centers and regional centers. These centers supply research-based information and products in their specific areas that regional centers use when working with SEAs. This slide provides links to a few of those resources specific to serving English learners and English learners students with disabilities. The last bullet on this page, the last bullet on this page references the National Center on Improving Literacy, which is a center funded by awards from OESE in partnership with OSEP. The National Center on Improving Literacy's mission is to increase access to and use of evidence-based approaches to screen, identify, and teach students with literacy-related disabilities, including dyslexia. All right, now you might be asking yourself, Amy, that was a lot of information for me to absorb, and what could I possibly else could I need to know today? Well, I have one more thing to talk about, which is pretty important, and it's the upcoming peer review of the English language proficiency assessments. The ESEA continues to require each state to administer to all students who are identified as English learners, including English learners with disabilities, an annual English language proficiency assessment that is aligned to the state's English language proficiency standards. Additionally, the ESEA requires the English language proficiency assessments for all English learners and alternate English language proficiency assessment for English learners who are students with the most significant cognitive disabilities in grades K through 12 be submitted for peer review. and our updated peer review guide was released in September of 2018. The annual English language proficiency assessment requirement applies to all grades K through 12 in which there are ELs in schools served by the state. The ESEA requires that the annual English language proficiency assessment be uniform, valid, reliable, and statewide, and provide coherent and timely information to parents about each student's attainment of the state's English language proficiency standards. A state must provide appropriate accommodations for English learners with disabilities. And if an English learner has a disability that precludes assessment in one or more domains of the ELP assessment, such that there are no appropriate accommodations for the affected domain, the state must assess the student's English language proficiency based on the remaining domains for which it is possible to assess the student. In addition, states must administer an alternate ELP assessment for English learners with the most significant cognitive disabilities who cannot participate in the ELP assessment even with appropriate accommodations. A state may develop alternate ELP achievement standards for the alternate ELP assessment. We highlighted a few publications and tools from NCEO and NCSI that could be useful to states as they are thinking through assessment policies, aligning of initiatives, and ensuring successful implementation of these initiatives. As we attempted to demonstrate throughout this call, the TA centers are full of resources, and we encourage states to reach out to their TA providers with specific requests for information. All right, now I'm going to pause and see if we have any more questions. So there was a question, one of the questions is there guidance for LEAs to remove erroneous identification of ELs with disabilities years after the identification was made? So, so this is a good question. So the guidance that we just released has some questions, or I think just has the one question related to erroneous identification, and some examples I gave talking through what that might look like, how a student might be erroneously identified. There is no broad guidance because these would be individual student decisions, considerations. So I think as you think through looking at how the child was identified, was the appropriate accommodations given, was the assessment appropriate for that child? I mean, there's a whole variety of factors that you would want to consider, but no, we don't have any more broader guidance than that on that. But there are, if you have some specific questions about that, I encourage you to, follow up with a specific question. We got a question, is there a single document and resource guide with all the links? And thank you for that question because we were just talking about that before the presentation. We have developed one single document. We just haven't finished finalizing it. So we are going to send it out. So you're going to get the PowerPoint today or tomorrow. And we'll follow up as soon as our one-pager is ready, and it will have all the links. It'll be a friendly infographic that, one-pager that you can use. So stay tuned. So we have some questions that we need to, do a little research on or think about. So if I'm going to get to my contact slide. So here's our contacts. If you have a specific question related to this presentation or generally about how OSEP supports English learners with disabilities, feel free to reach out to me. My information is on that slide. If you have state-specific questions about IDEA Part B or Part C and how these requirements would apply to your grant, your state, the state contact list is at that side. And then if you have questions about how implement the Title I, Title III of the ESEA, you would want to reach out to your Office of State Support and Accountability state contact, and the link to their contacts are at this site. So please feel free to follow up with to any of us asking us questions about this topic. Additionally, so we just got another question that says, is there any guidance on English language proficiency screeners for students with disabilities or at risk of disabilities? So as you may or may not know, the requirement to screen and identify students is an OCR requirement. So, you know, the OCR website has a bunch of resources generally about serving, identifying, and serving English learners. So I think if you want to send me an email, I can follow up with where the specific information is that OCR provides on that. Otherwise, you know, you could go to the department's website and look at the OCR site. I mean, it would be more general about the requirements for identifying an English learner. Okay, great. Okay, great. We got a recommendation to pull this into one document so we can share with the LEAs. The infographic we send out in the next couple weeks, hopefully. Well, feel free to share with your LEAs all the resources here. And if there's resources that we're missing, we would love to hear them. So send them our way, which is the perfect. Hear myself on two screens. It's the perfect lead into my final thank you slide and a plug for the survey that's going to go out after this presentation. It'll have 3 short questions about how OSEP can better support work around serving states serving English learners with disabilities, any other questions you might have, and some exciting work we'd like to hear if there's exciting collaborative work going on in your state. So look out for those survey questions, look out for the PowerPoint, and look out for the infographic. And I'll let Greg wrap it up.
Okay, we're over here high-fiving Amy on the terrific job that she did leading us through this volume of material, very complex yet very timely and important material on English language learners. As she said, this PowerPoint will be available shortly. We're hoping probably tomorrow. So if you were not able to frantically write down all the URLs that were flashing on the screens, you should be able to do that at your leisure later on. So thanks for joining us today, and I wanted to invite you to our next monthly call, our April call, which will be on Thursday, April 11th. I think it will be of particular interest to those of you involved with Part C. It will be on the Part C Child Find self-assessment. So please stay tuned for that. We'll be sending out an announcement about a week before that call. So thanks again, and this will conclude our call.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.